The 3D Sonic games are infamous for their scatterbrained, misguided attempts at constantly reinventing the wheel. Previously established pursuits of Sonic gameplay are often abandoned in favor of some radical new departure from convention. This lack of confidence in their own franchise's essential elements has spiraled so far out of control that the developers can't even decide on a consistent set of controls for Sonic. It's now up to the player to tweak sliders and checkboxes in a trial-and-error attempt to finally make Sonic feel good to play. Sonic Adventure, the series' first fully 3D mainline title, originally released only a month after I was born. It may also be the first Sonic game I ever played, and in many ways, it's still something I think of rather fondly. To this day, Adventure is often praised as the closest attempt at recapturing Sonic's classic fundamentals in 3D. But that's often where the conversation ends. In this video, I would like to offer a different, more nuanced perspective. In my opinion, 3D Sonic has fundamentally remained stagnant, recycling the same tired mechanics for over 2 decades. Through thick and thin, despite the new gimmick of the week in an attempt to shamelessly mimic the current trend, every single 3D Sonic game is guilty of the same problems, all of which can be traced back to Sonic's initial adaptation to the third dimension in 1998. There is still no officially released 3D Sonic game that properly captures the appeal of what Sonic is, or, I suppose, what Sonic was back on the Mega Drive. I'd like to view Sonic Adventure, and as a result, all of 3D Sonic, through this particular lens. To be clear, while this video will be critical of specific aspects across this series, I do not hate Sonic Adventure and all the other 3D Sonic games, and I certainly don't dislike any of them solely for being different. I firmly believe that Sonic can work excellently in 3D, and I hope you'll understand my complicated viewpoint by the end of this. When considered independently from what came before, Sonic's movement in Adventure is limited but solid. His acceleration on flat ground feels very natural, along with the way his speed modulates when traveling across slopes. Despite some wonky collision, the player can effortlessly scale walls and other curved terrain without any additional automation or scripting, a seamless extension of what Sonic could uniquely achieve in 2D. The immense speed of the spin dash, combined with the gracious mid-air control and lengthy airtime of each jump, allow for the player to cover enormous distances without touching the ground. Just like in 2D, Sonic can utilize this terrain to gain tremendous height, fulfilling the fast-paced, explorative fantasy inherent to Sonic as a character. It's this one mechanic that makes controlling him so enjoyable, along with the general responsiveness upon making tight turns, much unlike the race car feeling he would devolve to in the later games. Personally, I find his turning to be a bit too tight in this game, but considering the rest of what I'll cover in this video, this is a very minor complaint. Unfortunately, this is where most of Adventure's similarities to the classics end in regards to gameplay. I typically think we should try to criticize games for what they are, but sometimes the clearest issues are the elements that simply feel missing. Sonic may be able to reach great speeds, but his sense of flow is constantly undermined by lacking the subtleties once present in 2D. Any interactions with enemies, item boxes, springs, and dash ramps will set Sonic to an arbitrary, predetermined speed and height, killing the player's momentum. Jumping into an enemy stops Sonic dead in his tracks, where in the classics he would continue to move forward as normal, which felt fantastic. This isn't some nitpicky Sonic fan complaint. Even Mario could do this, both in 2D and 3D. Sonic's homing attack suffers in the same way, jarringly halting the player in midair no matter their speed beforehand. This made some sense in the limited view of Sonic 3D Blast, with its slower-paced, isometric perspective and focus on hunting down enemies, but not in a fast-paced, fully 3D platformer where the player can clearly see ahead of them in most situations. These floating item boxes seem to be the only exception to the rule, letting Sonic carry his speed after jumping through them, or using the homing attack. The universal ability to bounce off enemies and item boxes while retaining height and speed, known colloquially as the Badnik bounce, isn't present here either, both when using the homing attack or directly jumping onto an enemy. In 2D, springs were modular and additive to Sonic's velocity, shooting him in a direction without removing any speed perpendicular to its launch vector. In 3D, they override Sonic's velocity, only sending him in a fixed direction, and at a set speed, completely removing any utility outside of their explicit binary intent from the level designers. Sonic can roll down slopes to gain a bit more speed than he would on foot, but only after activating a spin dash, which is so easily spammable that it may as well be a prototype of the boost system seen later in the series. Tails and Knuckles are able to curl at any time without spin dashing, but it's rather useless, and baffling to see it not included in Sonic's moveset. Otherwise, there's very little focus on physics-based level design, with many stages relying on linear paths, automated set pieces, and an extreme application of dash panels, far greater than was ever seen in 2D. Even though Sonic's movement system is clearly capable of launching off slopes with speed, many of these ramps are made with automated dash panels, lacking any faith in the player's agency or the strengths of the level design. I don't feel a sense of these levels being intertwined and explorative. At most, there might be a hidden item behind the initial view of the camera, or maybe a few shortcuts that are easy to spot, but these stages are still fairly straightforward, without much of the layered design classic Sonic is known for. Adventure 2 didn't even try to hide this fact, turning plenty of levels into long, narrow hallways. But at least it had honed in on optimizing stages for a more score attack design philosophy, although I'm not fond of this approach either. Since these stages were designed explicitly with Sonic in mind, no longer needing to function for other characters like in Adventure 1, this more obvious linearity feels like squandered potential that could have instead been placed in making levels much more akin to the classics. I could excuse this by acknowledging the tight schedule that Sonic Adventure 2 was developed under, but then I'd also have to excuse the faults of just about every single Sonic game. One could interpret the loop-de-loops as a form of flashy spectacle even in Sonic's formative years, and they are, to an extent, but in those days, they were an effortless combination of style and substance. Loops began as obstacles to players, a form of speed check that taught them the importance of building momentum through the environment. This was especially true in their debut game, which lacked the spin dash. Traversing a loop wasn't just a binary success. Players were offered a chance to exit with significantly higher speed than they started with, because Sonic's momentum and core movement techniques were never taken away from them. In Sonic Adventure, loops offer no gameplay benefit whatsoever, as they force control away from the player and rely strictly on automation. Trying to roll or spin dash through a loop, arguably Sonic's primary ability and his only core action other than jumping or using the homing attack, will almost always result in Sonic exiting the loop and potentially falling to his death. The optimal tactic when traveling through a loop in 3D is to momentarily cease interaction with the game, which I can only view as a complete failure. This is the same reason why I take issue with the missing Badnik bounce, because in the classics, enemies weren't just obstacles to avoid, and item boxes weren't just a quick power-up. Everything played a part in Sonic's movement. They were all tools, just like the loops, the springs, and the terrain itself. All of 2D Sonic felt designed for modularity and versatility, rarely locking the player into static, binary situations. The one valuable contribution to Sonic's moveset in Adventure 2 was the bounce attack, but even this is a heavily diminished version of the bubble shield from Sonic 3. Sonic's bounce height is a lot less variable depending on the player's height and speed, and actually bounces lower to the ground when rebounding off an enemy, a complete opposite of how it behaved in 2D. Sonic Mania would drastically improve this by letting the bounce build horizontal momentum on slopes, further leading me to be disappointed with its implementation so far in 3D. The Insta-Shield has never made the jump to the third dimension, which might have allowed players to break enemies and item boxes without relying on the homing attack. The Lightning Shield is the only returning elemental shield, and while it still draws in rings, it no longer gives Sonic a double jump. Exploring these stages for item boxes would be more rewarding if the power-ups had actual utility like they did in Sonic 3. A temporary enhancement that allows inexperienced players to correct their jumps in midair and offers skilled players extra height and distance for big shortcuts is a lot nicer than a shield that draws in rings but does nothing else. I find this to be an important point, because the better a player gets at a game, the less they're going to need superfluous items like extra lives or rings. Experienced players aren't going to get hit, so they don't need shields purely for defense, nor do they need to worry about getting a game over, making one-ups and continues worthless as well. Elemental shields with unique abilities provide a tangible gameplay upgrade, meaning that they always have value across all skill levels. I wish this principle was applied across all of Sonic's mechanics. Boss fights have never been Sonic's strength, but they could thankfully be completed very quickly by a proactive player. The battles of Sonic Adventure are mostly the opposite, waiting for the one weak point to finally expose itself, attacking it, and waiting again. That, or the other extreme, where they're so mindlessly easy that I question their inclusion in the first place. These are all pace breakers, boring exercises in frustration before the player can return to the desirable parts of the experience. Special stages are removed as well, although this might be a net positive, and Supersonic is only playable during the final boss fight. For someone like myself who has grown up on these games, it can feel quite confronting to stop and consider just how much was lost in translation from the Mega Drive to the Dreamcast. Many of these changes and omissions could have easily been ignored had the series improved upon this foundation in the future, or supplemented their absence with solid new gameplay concepts only possible in 3D. Remember, I'm focusing on Sonic here, since he's the base that all others derive from. For what it's worth, I think Tails and Knuckles actually made the transition relatively well, even if they suffer from the same problems as Sonic. Mario underwent major adjustments when shifting to 3D, abandoning its guided, linear platforming challenges and focusing on large, open-ended sandboxes. What separates Mario and Sonic in this instance is that Mario's change felt purposeful. Nintendo seemed to understand that they could embrace the wider spaces and more complex movement available in 3D, giving Mario a slew of brand new iconic moves that he still uses today. Sonic Adventure decided to sand off every edge by automating as much as possible and restricting the player's movement. The spin dash jump is Sonic's only saving grace because it faithfully carried over its function from 2D, naturally enhanced thanks to the added degrees of use in 3 dimensions. I am forever grateful to have received this over the cancelled Sonic Extreme, which looked abysmal, but that doesn't mean I'm going to excuse the problems within Sonic Adventure. As the years went on, 3D Mario began to incorporate more of the missing elements from its 2D roots, eventually creating a handful of 3D games that directly adapted the core of 2D Mario. Sonic may have adopted more superficial elements from the classics, but has never undergone such a transformation in terms of controls or level design. Every 3D Sonic title since Adventure inherited this strange desire to contradict Sonic's fundamentals by breaking the player's flow wherever possible. This reached a ridiculous peak in Sonic 06, where players couldn't even jump into enemies to deal damage or bounce off of them, showcasing just how reliant Sonic Team had become on the homing attack, itself an additional form of automation to make the act of play even more mindless. 25 years after Sonic Adventure, Sonic Frontiers still suffers from all of the same problems. The player will lose all of their speed when hitting enemies or springs, the homing attack carries no momentum, and environments are loaded with heavy automation, made all the more egregious considering this title's nature as an open zone experience. Even when re-implementing the spin dash in a later patch, it only behaved as a better version of the already existing boost, something that Lost World had previously done years beforehand with little to no fanfare. Let's not forget how it was locked behind S-ranking a series of boring post-game action chain challenges, meaning that new players can't even attempt to use this positive inclusion to Sonic's base movement abilities until after the game is already over. I was never much of a fan of the Lightspeed Dash, as it basically acted as another element of extreme automation, but at least Sonic conserved his speed after using it. In Frontiers, it stops Sonic dead in his tracks. It really feels as if every single mechanic in the game is working against the player's flow and drive for fluidity. For as much as I've complained, Sonic's jump to 3D did deliver some positive alterations to suit its new perspective. Item boxes were made to be clear and spherical, thus viewable from all angles, unlike the monitors used in 2D that would always face the camera. Checkpoints no longer use a single vertical lamppost, but act as two lowered posts that form a wider horizontal barrier, raising up after Sonic dashes through them. These are much harder for the player to miss when racing around in 3D, their new appearance now reminiscent of crossing the finish line of an on-foot race. Springs are more clearly signified with large star icons on their face, helping to convey their orientation in 3D space. Some have also been made wider, so that players are less likely to accidentally run past them. Retractable spikes are now visible beforehand, preventing the player from being unfairly blindsided. The snowboarding sequence in Sonic 3's Ice Cap Zone looked cool, but wasn't very interactive, and it drags the beginning of the stage every time I revisit it. Ice Cap makes a return in Sonic Adventure, and so does the snowboard, but now it's much more involved, even if still quite simple. Grinding has reached a ridiculous level of automation in the later games, but in its inception, it allowed for some creative ways of redirecting speed. I've always been fond of these vertical rails in Final Rush, letting Sonic dash into them horizontally, carry that speed vertically along the rail, and manually jump off at the top for some serious air. The Chao Garden feels a little incongruous with Sonic's fast-paced gameplay, but it provided an optional incentive for replaying stages and exploring for rare animals. This kind of alternative minigame running in parallel with the main campaign would have been much more at home in a somewhat open-world game like Sonic Frontiers. The saddest part of charting this series' progression is noticing the other rare moments it gets something right, but either refuses to expand upon them or abandons them for the very next release. Even in the worst Sonic games, there's usually something fun about them, and that fun is almost always linked to a feeling of flow and fluidity. Shadow the Hedgehog, despite its focus on gunplay, does surprisingly let Shadow jump through enemies without losing speed. Or to be more precise, not any more than the speed he already loses by jumping. However, Shadow can no longer bounce off enemies without using the homing attack, likely so that his standard jump state can deal multiple hits of damage against this game's tanky adversaries. Despite their absurd tonal disconnect to Sonic's cartoon appeal, Shadow's firearms are often praised for their practicality, possibly because it allows the player to move and attack enemies at the same time without affecting their momentum, unlike the much slower alternative of repeatedly using the homing attack. This move became so ubiquitous with Sonic's gameplay identity that even the 2D games started using it. I can't fathom a good reason as to why, as it's exceedingly boring, but at least Sonic 4's Jump Dash let players chain through a series of enemies quickly, which felt great. Sonic and the Black Knight has a similar quirk. Its swordplay is slow, clunky, and counterintuitive to Sonic's flow by making him stand still and slash at enemies one by one. Take away the flashy presentation, and what you've got is an even more monotonous version of the homing attack. And yet, the one thing I hear consistently praised about Black Knight's gameplay is the ability to dash forwards, swing the sword, and turn Sonic into a buzzsaw to blast through a chain of enemies without awkwardly coming to a stop. The boost games would eventually let Sonic preserve his momentum after bouncing off an enemy, but only while jumping straight into them, once again making the homing attack feel lethargic by comparison. Boosting through enemies in these games feels satisfying for the same reason it did to roll straight through them in Sonic 1. It doesn't slow Sonic down. Slope physics also made a subtle return. Sonic will speed up when running downhill and lose speed going uphill. Stomping and sliding can increase this further, not unlike Sonic's now long-forgotten ability to curl into a ball. The problem, of course, is that these are all games where Sonic has a boost button that provides instantaneous bursts of speed, completely nullifying any need to rely on the terrain to build momentum. Some ramps appear to be slightly scripted anyway, removing much room for stylish speed-based platforming. This only got worse with Frontiers, with its unambiguously scripted ramps and near-complete lack of slope physics. If there was ever an example of how low the standards have become for 3D Sonic, I'd point right here. I don't want all of my complaints about breaking flow to sound like a first-time Sonic player running into walls and complaining that the game is bad. That's a different topic entirely. We're talking about the player being punished for overcoming the obstacles in their way by having their speed taken away from them. When everything they can interact with slows Sonic down, why would they want to engage with any of it? I'm aware that this is an extremely common point to bring up, but it really baffles me just how long it took for Sonic to receive any kind of parkour system, only for them to throw it out and never try it again. With better implementation, this kind of advanced movement is exactly the type of high skill ceiling inclusion that 3D Sonic needs, perfectly facilitating platforming and exploration through the application of speed. It would pair wonderfully with something similar to Sonic CD's speed-based time travel or Advance 2's boost mode, both of which reward the player for maintaining flow through the level design for an extended period of time, never coming to a stop. Why not let Sonic's bounce attack rebound off vertical geometry to redirect his horizontal speed, like throwing a bouncy ball? There is so much potential beyond what was in the classic games, but outside of some promising fan projects, we have yet to see such things fully realized. I don't want to oversell it, but the Apple Arcade exclusive Sonic Dream Team has shockingly better movement than most other 3D Sonic games. Players can launch off slopes with speed, use half-pipes to build and redirect momentum, scale walls just like in the adventure games, and, for the first time ever in 3D Sonic, maintain their horizontal momentum when bouncing off these large rectangular springs. I've only ever seen this nuance replicated in unofficial Sonic fan games, so seeing it here was a genuine shock. Don't get me wrong, there are still many other issues carried over from past 3D Sonic games, and a new restriction preventing players from jumping off grind rails for mid-air shortcuts, which was the one unequivocally fun thing about Frontiers. But for a mobile game developer's first ever attempt at creating a fully 3D Sonic title, this is very impressive. And it's frankly embarrassing that these ideas were never attempted beforehand in previous titles. I believe the lack of momentum and pinball physics would have been much more acceptable had Sonic teams supplemented them with something else equally as engaging and fitting of Sonic's character. Sonic Generations is still, in my opinion, the closest we've ever come to reaching such a balance, solely for its strong level design that capitalized on the joy of speedrunning. I don't at all find this to be an authentic 3D Sonic experience, nor a 2D one for that matter, but it manages to feel great in spite of its shortcomings compared to Sonic's signature gameplay concept. Here's some food for thought. I mentioned earlier that without the spin dash jump, Sonic Adventure's movement would have been much less enjoyable, and thankfully I have Sonic Frontiers to use as a perfect example. At its launch, Sonic would immediately lose all momentum when jumping, which unsurprisingly felt awful. An option was later included to adjust Sonic's jump deceleration, finally enabling players to recapture some of the series' charm by launching him across the terrain. This change, along with the spin dash, appeared to have been received with unanimous positivity. So I have to ask, How was the game better by not including these features beforehand? Why did they need to address such a basic part of Sonic's fluidity in a post-launch update? In what way do 3D Sonic games actually benefit from regurgitating the same watered-down, heavily automated facsimile of Sonic's gameplay? How can Sonic Frontiers be seriously considered as a step in the right direction when it's once again placing Sonic into the latest out-of-date trend, while maintaining the same derivative issues from Sonic Adventure? In an arguably even more controversial stance, I have to question what was gained by discontinuing Sonic's original aesthetics with his arrival to the Dreamcast. Previous 3D Sonic spin-offs wonderfully preserved the eclectic charm of what we now know as classic Sonic, but Adventure began a conscious push towards a more realistic, grounded world. Later titles would take this to such a comical extreme that I can't tell if Adventure's more appropriate 90s anime look was a result of hardware limitations or an intentional artistic decision. Put simply, these worlds don't scream Sonic the Hedgehog to me, especially when compared to Sonic's earlier 3D appearances or the more classic look found in this gorgeous concept art. Windy Valley's infamous beta stage encapsulates this quite well, appearing far more colorful and, for lack of a better term, Sonic-y than the final game's version. I find it much more compelling for Sonic to offer up imaginative worlds that only it can provide, rather than awkwardly inserting him into increasingly photorealistic human cities or flat stretches of grassland with grey box platforms in the sky. Even with my misgivings, there are rare moments that the 3D games have recaptured and evolved some of the appeal of early 2D Sonic. A grand, globe-trotting adventure across a somewhat stylized reinterpretation of Earth, visiting different cultures and saving the world. An interstellar amusement park linking an array of wacky planets together by giant chains, capturing both the serenity of nature and the tyranny of Eggman's reign. Sonic Heroes remains the closest the 3D modern series has ever gotten to reaching the visual appeal of classic Sonic, without regressing into a childish imitation of its former self. The returning stages of Sonic Generations are a great attempt to modernize the classics in line with the style presented in Unleashed and Colors, but they don't feel like the Mega Drive titles seamlessly adapted into 3 dimensions. There's so much more earthy detail to the geometry and textures, presenting a world that still feels fantastical, but a lot less surreal and stylish. Sonic Superstars is supposed to be an original, classic Sonic game in 2.5D, but has a visual aesthetic more in line with Sonic Lost World, itself an overly toy-like, Mario-fied imitation of the classics. Let's not forget how Super Mario Wonder released in the same week, gorgeously evocative of Mario's iconic 2D illustrations, flawlessly recreated with 3D graphics. Sonic has yet to see such treatment in 3D, even when the games themselves still play across 2 dimensions. For as much as I can complain about Adventure setting an unfortunate precedent with its visuals, I can't do the same for the shift in musical direction. It may not be the same funky New Jack Swing style as the classics, but the score of Sonic Adventure and many future 3D Sonic games stand up on their own merits, and suit the series wonderfully. Personally, Adventure's soundtrack is still one of my favorites across the whole series, but I see no reason why we can't strike a balance between these different genres. What's stopping some 3D Sonic games from sounding like Sonic CD and Knuckles Chaotix again, while letting others sound like Adventure or Unleashed? It doesn't need to be a binary split between 2 different extremes. Pizza Tower's soundtrack is more traditionally Sonic-like than most of what we hear nowadays, outside of the explicitly classic games like Mania and Superstars. This line-in-the-sand division between classic and modern Sonic has only caused further issues, as Sonic Team proved themselves incapable of understanding what made the classic style appealing to begin with. Notably, there's now an arbitrary expectation for classic Sonic to be overly cute, simple, and lacking in narrative ambitions, with modern Sonic being loaded with dramatic storytelling and an increasing volume of unnecessary cutscenes. This has also extended to the irrational notion that any game with the classic aesthetic must be stuck in the past, and offer no room for innovation. I'm not at all against a stronger narrative focus in this series by using cutscenes and voice acting, but just like before, I need to ask what this actually adds to the experience of playing these games. Brevity is the soul of wit, after all, and a lot of these cutscenes are extremely inefficient at conveying information or progressing an emotionally satisfying story. But because having cutscenes and voice acting is the default for modern Sonic games, even those with the most basic of plots are padded out with dry conversational cinematics. Once again, just like the now pointless loop-de-loops, this tradition is continued for tradition's sake, not for enhancing the quality of the game in question. I'd like to make it extremely clear that everything surrounding the enjoyment of art is subjective. I'm not here to place strict labels on what art should or should not be. However, when Sonic has lost this much of his gameplay identity, I believe it's worth asking if these are even really Sonic games anymore. Do they retain the elements that made Sonic stand out in his golden years, or are they just painting a Sonic skin on top of other, unrelated gameplay mechanics? Of course, factually speaking, if it's an officially released game in the Sonic the Hedgehog series, then it counts as a Sonic game. But just because we can slap Sonic on top of Puyo Puyo or Mario Kart doesn't make it authentically feel like a Sonic game, does it? There must be a collection of traits that make Sonic unique, the kinds of things that separate Sonic from every other video game on the market. As another brief disclaimer, there is nothing wrong with enjoying and preferring these Sonic games, but that doesn't change the fact that they are very, very different to the initial vision of what Sonic was. I think Helldivers 2 is a lot of fun. If the next Sonic game was literally just Helldivers 2 with Sonic in it, would that be a good Sonic game? Is this the direction we want the series to follow for the next decade? If not, then we must admit that there are some more central elements to Sonic that the game is missing. Why do we associate games like Freedom Planet, Spark the Electric Jester, and Rolling Rascal with Sonic? Is it perhaps because these games share a plethora of distinct Sonic-like traits that we are all implicitly aware of? Controlling cartoony characters to build speed across sloping level design in unrealistically bright, colorful environments? Even if Sonic's one defining attribute is that he has to be fast, why? If Sonic can be anything, why does it matter if he's fast or slow? Is it because it's the one inarguable component connecting every mainstream interpretation of the character together across games, comics, film, and television? The one truly consistent detail about Sonic as a character and playable game protagonist across almost all of his appearances? If you think it's ridiculous for me to joke that the next Sonic game will play like Helldivers, then ask yourself to define in detail why you feel that way. If it's because Helldivers is a shooter, then we have successfully identified that Sonic's identity is not in shooting. That's valuable. Through the process of elimination, we could further define what Sonic isn't to help discover what Sonic is. If this series, not counting explicit spin-offs or crossovers, can truly be anything, then the concept of Sonic means nothing. If there's nothing particular about Sonic that we like, then why do we like Sonic at all? To explore this further, I'd like to offer some criticism towards another series conversion to 3D, which happens to be one of the most critically acclaimed games ever made. Despite the drastic shift in perspective, Metroid Prime effortlessly maintains the heavy focus on exploring a non-linear alien world, gathering meaningful key upgrades and optional hidden items. It retained the soul of 2D Metroid's trademark atmosphere, amplifying the immersion with an enormous attention to detail that was previously unachievable, and used this new viewpoint to provide distinct gameplay twists. However, compared to how Samus played in 2D, Prime is a major regression of speed, agility, and player agency. Platforming is heavily de-emphasized, Samus can no longer wall jump, Morph Ball bomb jumping was nerfed, and there's no speed booster, meaning she can also no longer perform Shine Sparks. These restrictions deviate Prime away from Metroid's origins in ways that may appear subtle at first, but make the experience much less freeform, with fewer opportunities to sequence break. I will always lament the loss of these features in the Prime series, but truthfully, I don't think I'd mind them as much had the game not also suffered from boring boss fights, tedious backtracking, and an arbitrary endgame artifact hunt. Prime's slower pace is different from the 2D games, but while I certainly don't prefer it, it's not an inherent negative either, thanks to the rest of the game maintaining Metroid's spirit in ways that were only possible in first-person 3D. Funnily enough, a more ideal version of Samus's movement in 3D exists in the Metroid Vanguard mod for Sonic Robo Blast 2, an excellent and very faithful classic Sonic fan game, itself a mod of the original Doom. There's a nuance here when discussing the quality of a series reinventing itself. The new open-world Zelda games wonderfully innovate upon the freedom and creativity of the franchise's 8-bit origins, but may have overcorrected by de-emphasizing their more guided sections, notably the dungeons. Resident Evil 4 turned the fixed-camera survival horror series into an over-the-shoulder tactical shooter, but performed so well at its new ideas while maintaining some of the soul of what came before that it was pretty hard to complain. We could remove Samus, Ridley, and the Metroids from Prime, and it would still have retained some of the explorative essence of classic 2D Metroid, even if the details are quite different. Other than a vague sense of going fast and traveling through automated loops, I don't see much of Sonic's characteristic gameplay present in any of his 3D titles, because all they've done is drift further and further away from the already lacking framework in Sonic Adventure. Perhaps Sonic's inconsistency is part of the charm, a series that never wants to slip into a comfortable lull, always looking for new ideas and new directions. That sounds great on paper, but if we consider the output Sonic has received from this jumbled mess of concepts, I think it's easy to see the value in returning to its roots, at least for a little while, before moving on to something very different. I don't dislike these games purely for being bad Sonic games. I think a lot of them just aren't very good regardless of what series they belong to. I would have no attachment whatsoever to a game like Sonic and the Black Knight or the live-action Sonic movies if not for the fact that they are official Sonic products. I only care about new Sonic releases because of my attachment to the handful of Sonic-related things that made me a fan in the first place. There's a reason so many Sonic fan games are built around directly adapting Sonic's momentum physics into 3D. Often accompanied by the classic Sonic aesthetic, because there's an audience for this type of game who has yet to be served through official means. After the Metroid series underwent a lengthy hiatus from the critical and commercial failure of Other M, fans were treated to Metroid Prime Federation Force, a cooperative first-person shooter set within the Metroid universe that played completely differently to the established formula. It had Metroids in it, and it used a similar combat system as the Prime games, but this was not a Metroid game, and as a result, it too underperformed. Nintendo clearly learnt their lesson, and now Metroid has undergone something of a resurgence, with Metroid Dread becoming the best-selling game in the series, accompanied by extremely positive reviews and a fourth Metroid Prime title in active development. I'm not trying to imply that all audiences actually know what they want, but Metroid succeeded by returning to what it did best, and most importantly, evolved from that foundation, producing arguably the best game in the franchise. Dread wasn't just Super Metroid again, and future Sonic games shouldn't just be Sonic 1 through 3 again either. Do I even need to mention the infamous Devil May Cry reboot, followed by the return of the original series with the phenomenal Devil May Cry 5? Or do I dare acknowledge the existence of Sonic the Hedgehog 4, invalidated years later by the incredible return to form that was Sonic Mania? I can think of no stronger parallel than the initial character design for Sonic's live-action feature film debut, mocked not just by the core Sonic fanbase, but by the entire world. Despite the fact that this design is still recognizably Sonic the Hedgehog, it was obvious that the details were completely wrong, and didn't capture the same appeal of his original look. It may have been a version of Sonic, but it wasn't Sonic as we know him. I won't pretend to enjoy his updated model in the final film, but I can't deny it's much closer to what everyone wanted to see, a faithful representation of Sonic's original cartoony appeal. This is what 3D Sonic's gameplay is in desperate need of, a return to the fundamentals. Expressive, flowful movement with a focus on building momentum across stylized environments, lacking the extreme amounts of automation that the series has become far too accustomed to. Just because something kind of looks like Sonic doesn't mean it feels like Sonic. I don't see the harm in wanting a series to play to its strengths, instead of badly copying everyone else. Sonic Frontiers, on paper, is the kind of bold innovation I genuinely want to see from this franchise, but it remains to be held back by a refusal of true, meaningful alterations to Sonic's base movement mechanics and level design philosophy. I don't have faith in future games being any better when the reintroduction of other playable characters feels so much worse than what we already had back in Sonic Adventure. Long-running series are bound to change eventually, but change too much and you'll be left with something unrecognizable from what it once was. Sonic Adventure is remembered as the best Sonic has felt to control in 3D, not simply because of its own qualities, but because everything afterwards has only exemplified the bad parts, moving further away from its potential as a faithful adaptation of 2D Sonic. I wouldn't take as much issue with games like Forces or Frontiers if they were released alongside the kind of games that I've been asking for. Part 1 of the excellent Sonic Spitball video series was released almost a decade ago, and yet every single point is still just as relevant as it was then. 3D Sonic remains stagnant. I don't think that following from the classics is the only way to make a good Sonic game, but it's certainly the most sensible one. If we're going to keep trying all these different ideas anyway, would it hurt to actually try this one? I just want to play 3D Sonic games that feel like Sonic games. If that's too unreasonable of a request, or we can't even agree on what a Sonic game is, or should be, then it shows just how far Sonic has fallen.